First of all, I would say that chain analysis is very reliable. And just to get to the question of my interest, to be honest, my main interest is in everyday life in North Korea. But in studying North Korea, I quickly realized that the nuclear program casts a long shadow on every aspect of life in North Korea. Kim Jong-un has invested so much in his nuclear strategy that every single North Korean is implicated and affected by that dominant nature of his single-minded drive to build nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. So absolutely, when North Korea is launching round after round of ballistic missiles, we really have no choice but to look at this question of where the money is coming from. You know, North Korea, their state media, they like to project the best side of Pyongyang, its most modern, its most sophisticated side. But the fact is, North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's a country that has been living with sanctions for decades, including some of the most stringent sanctions that have ever been imposed by the UN Security Council. And the border, on top of all of that, the border has been pretty much sealed for the past 2.5 years. There's been very little getting through that border, and that means very little export and import for a country that relies on the outside world for fuel, for food, and other basic necessities. And still, Kim Jong-un has managed to add to his formidable weapons program. He's added new weapons, he's expanded, and we've seen hypersonic weapons, submarine launched ballistic missiles. So he's really added to his arsenal in the last few years. So it really does raise that question, how has he managed to raise the funds? So I am not a cyber expert, but I did spend many years as a journalist in North Korea. I made reporting trips to North Korea from 2008 to 2017. And I was there during what I like to call the succession period. And this is during the time when Kim Jong-il was preparing his son, Kim Jong-un, to become North Korea's next leader. And during that period, one thing that I noticed was this propaganda campaign that was really centered on science and technology. That became Kim Jong-un's, I guess what we could call his campaign platform. And during this period, I spent a lot of time with students at Kim Il-sung University, Kim Chek University, the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. And I got the sense that Kim Jong-un was not only trying to woo these students who would become his future power base, they are really in some sense his peers. He's trying to woo them with science and technology, but also investing in an elite group of students to become very computer savvy. At the same time, we could see that modernization was part of his strategy. Modernization is very key for the development of North Korea's economy. Science and technology are key components of modernization. But as we were seeing the North Koreans modernize factories, get online, digitize, I couldn't help but wonder if this investment in science and technology had a dark side as well. As you may know, North Korea has a very long history of illicit money making to try to get around the sanctions. Everything from forging currency, what we call super notes, to manufacturing drugs. But I wondered whether Kim Jong-un could be using science and technology as a tool, just like he was doing in the military by investing in nuclear weapons instead of conventional weapons, to find a new, more modern way to get around the sanctions and make money. And that's exactly what the FBI says North Korea has been doing. So I do have a podcast, so this is my chance to pitch my podcast. But in season 1 of my podcast, it's a BBC World Service podcast called The Lazarus Heist. That's exactly what we do, is we take a look at 3 major cyber attacks that the FBI blames on the North Koreans. We start with the Sony hack of 2014, which I think most people remember. This was a retaliatory attack on Sony Pictures for the making of this movie called The Interview. Then we go to the Bangladesh bank heist of 2016, in which the North Koreans just about managed to steal $1 billion. So again, another type of attack, because it was just focused on cyber theft. And then the WannaCry ransomware attack of 2017. Now, I should explain that, as I said, I'm not a cyber expert. My co-host is a tech journalist, and he explains the details, the technological details about how they carry out their attack. I would say my interest is in exploring why they're so motivated. And in looking at this question, of course, it comes back to Kim Jong-un and his drive to build nuclear weapons. So this is how I tie it all together. Uh, and what we found is that, yes, he has overseen the cultivation of a core group of what we call cyber warriors, who are trained from an early age to become elite hackers, to not only engage in cyber warfare, but also to steal funds through cyber theft. Now, these North Korean hackers have all kinds of nicknames that have been given to them by different governments and cybersecurity firms. For example, the US government often calls them Hidden Cobra. But then the name that we use is the Lazarus Group, which is also a very common name for the North Korean hackers. And I just want to tell you, the name comes from this biblical figure, Lazarus, who is a figure who comes back from the dead. And it's a perfect description, because every time these cybersecurity firms or government entities think they've stamped out these North Korean hackers, they come back. So they are incredibly resilient, incredibly ambitious. And you cited some figures earlier, but I can say that the US authorities suspect that they've managed to steal more than $2 billion in cyber theft over the last few years. And that doesn't include the reported theft of more than $600 million in cryptocurrency from a popular video game. And that news, that the US government believes it's the work of the Lazarus Group, was big news in Seoul when I was there last month. I think it was probably the first time that many South Koreans saw the name Lazarus Group in a newspaper headline. I was actually standing outside the Yonhap News building when I saw it on the ticker. And so it has now reached that level of awareness, I think, even among, hopefully it's reached a level of awareness among the South Korean public as well. The other big news that we saw in South Korea related to this type of cyber theft is that 2 South Koreans were arrested, and this was a few weeks ago, on suspicion of spying for North Korea. And they said that they were paid with a digital currency called Bitcoin. So we're starting to see some of these elements weave their way into the mainstream as well. And I think that even though cyber itself is very hard for us to wrap our heads around, I think that it's very important to recognize just the depth of their presence in our lives, as well as the amount of money that they're raising to fund North Korea's nuclear program. Now, one of the reasons why I think we haven't heard so much about North Korea's hackers is because we underestimate them. I don't think that we can imagine how a country as poor and disconnected as North Korea could possibly produce such successful hackers. So there's a bit of a disconnect in our minds. How could North Korea produce hackers when most of the people are disconnected from the internet? So how they managed to train these young men is a big part of my research. And it does mean that we study how they send these young men abroad. And so that does involve understanding and looking at that overseas network. And certainly looking at that overseas network has been fascinating. It's hard for them to learn how we use the internet unless they are part of our world. Nowadays, our lives are so much online, and especially in South Korea more so than any place else. And in some ways, for these hackers to become successful, they have to learn how we shop online, how we bank online, how we live online. And that makes us so much more vulnerable because they can hold us hostage, right? So I think even though this idea of North Korean hackers may seem like it's something that we everyday Americans and South Koreans don't need to worry about, in fact, they are targeting us in our everyday lives every single day. And so, South Korean experts will tell you that the number of cyber attacks from suspected North Korean hackers is over 1 million a day. It happens constantly, continuously. Now, as I said, I think that the details are very hard to comprehend. And sometimes when you say the word cyber, people's eyes just glaze over. And so for that reason, I think that even in the policy world in Washington, D.C., it is overlooked as a course of study. But I do believe that it needs to be part of our policy research when it comes to sanctions, because all we need to know is that with these stringent sanctions that the North Koreans face, and with the border closures, and we don't know when that's going to open up, North Korea is relying more heavily on cyber theft. Sanctions and borders don't matter in the world of cyberspace. And so I think it's very important for us, and we're looking at the growth of North Korea's nuclear program, as well as how to restrain and constrain that program, to think about how we are going to stop the flow of money into that program. And that requires looking at cyber. So when people ask, where do the North Koreans get the money from? My answer now is cyber. Unfortunately, I would say that North Korea's investment in cyber as a form of money making is something that has been very successful for them in circumventing sanctions. Unfortunately, so I've been looking at the past panel of expert reports from the United Nations, and these are experts who are gathered to really investigate sanctions violations. Now, the previous report didn't include much when it came to cyber, and that was a weakness that the experts acknowledged. But the latest report, which was issued in March, so just a few months ago, did include quite a sizable section on cyber. And so we're seeing experts really trying to hone in on how North Koreans are using cyber as a way to get around sanctions. So we're just now starting to see that investigation become part of the investigation of sanctions evasion. But it's very difficult, and this is precisely why the North Koreans use it. Cyber is notoriously difficult to trace, and it's very difficult to attribute. So it's very easy for anyone to make it look like another actor is behind that cyber attack. And for that, it's very hard. It's very easy for them to cover up their footsteps. And for that reason, it can be very, very hard to trace, track, and attribute these cyber attacks. However, I think the North Koreans are leaving some telltale signs. I think one of our cyber experts called it little crumbs, because I mean, there's some intriguing details, but if you understand North Korean, the language, you can also recognize that there's a difference in the language, right? There are slight variations in the spelling and vocabulary, and some of those come up in the malicious codes that the North Koreans are using. So I hope I'm not giving them a tip off, but I think there are some little clues that the North Koreans leave behind that allow the FBI in particular to connect the dots and connect these cyber attacks. They see a pattern of some of the small errors that the North Korean hackers are making. So I would say that this is an example of how they are very aggressive, but in some ways, because they haven't grown up in the internet the way we have, they're a little bit clumsy still. And those little clues give us a trail back to the source. But that, I think, but there's a big challenge when it comes to tracing and tracking. And then how do you stop these attacks? It's a challenge. And I think that part of what the sanctions regimes have to do is to really target those overseas networks, for example, that I mentioned, the support structure that provide the training to these young men who are dispatched to different countries on legitimate visas. And I should point out that this would have been several years ago, but were dispatched on legitimate visas to carry out IT work, but were moonlighting as hackers. And this is what the FBI believes. As you may know, UN Security Council resolutions required member states called on member states to send North Koreans back to Pyongyang by December 2019 as part of UN Security Council resolution sanctions. But whether or not all the North Koreans made it back remains a question. Not only did some countries not send them back, or some North Koreans simply did not go back, I think with the border closures, it was difficult for them to go back. And so I do think it's quite possible that we have quite a number of North Koreans still working overseas, perhaps illicitly, perhaps on forged visas, still carrying out some of this work. So for this, one way to really clamp down on this would be to target that overseas network. And we're certainly seeing the sanctions trying to get more and more specific in stemming the flow of currency back to North Korea, but also really making it very difficult for the North Koreans to operate overseas. In terms of what the North Koreans have been doing to circumvent US-led sanctions, absolutely this investment in cyber is their way to get around them. The challenge for the North Koreans now, they've been investing in cryptocurrency, is how to turn that digital currency into fiat currency. And so they are still facing some challenges, but we're seeing it's a little bit like a cat and mouse game, frankly, between the North Koreans and the Americans, in the sense that we're starting to see the US Treasury issue sanctions that are very specific and very targeted to try to really rein in these hackers by attacking the tools that they're using to try to get that money and turn it into fiat currency. So it is a bit of a cat and mouse game, I think. And unfortunately, it feels at times like the North Koreans are constantly one step ahead. Now, one of the things that I've been looking at is South Korea's role. Now, South Korea has been a target of cyber attacks from North Korea for a lot longer than the United States. The Sony attack in 2014 really was the first time that we in the United States, and to be honest, I was in North Korea at the time, but this is the first time that the Americans really became aware on a broader level of North Korea's ambitions. But as you probably know, South Korea has been a target for many years. And in some ways, I see South Korea as being kind of a practice ground. So everything that we were seeing in South Korea, we've seen them try out elsewhere. And so I think South Korea likely has a wealth of information and experience with North Korean cyber attacks that could be very useful as North Koreans take their cyber attacks global. You know, we've seen two summits between President Biden and South Korean president. So we had the summit with then President Moon Jae-in, and that was a very successful summit that also focused on the role that South Korea can play as a leader in technology. And then, of course, the more recent summit with President Yoon, and both of them very successful, but in perhaps slightly different ways. I think that this more recent summit with President Yoon was very successful in projecting that image of strength and unity. This trip by President Biden was really all about restoring alliances and reassuring allies in Asia that even though he's been preoccupied by Afghanistan and then Ukraine, that he hasn't forgotten about those partnerships. And it really was designed to convey and display this reassurance that the relationships are intact, and to project to adversaries that there's complete coordination and commitment on the part of the United States to its allies. So in that sense, I think it was very successful. I was happy last year with the summit between President Moon, then President Moon, and President Biden, to see that they had a line in their summit statement promising to create a working group on cyber. Unfortunately, I've heard that there hasn't been much progress, that the working group hasn't met very often. And that's disappointing because for the work that I do, I think it's absolutely necessary for them to take this threat very, very seriously. I was happy to see in reading Biden's statement from the White House that there was again that mention of an emphasis on a technology alliance, but also specifically on cyber. And I think this is an area where South Korea can really take a lead, not just with the relationship with the United States, but globally. South Korea is regarded in the rest of the world as being on the forefront of technology. And this is an area, South Korea's always been, well, I shouldn't say always, but I would say for the past 10 years, really been at the forefront of technology. Anything that I saw happening in South Korea, I knew would happen about 5 years later in the United States. We're very behind in some ways here. South Koreans are so quick to adapt, quick to innovate. And in the same way, South Koreans should take that sense of pride about their ability to adapt and innovate and really step forward and be a leader in every area of technology, and that includes cybersecurity. And so I would really like to see South Korea take the lead in this relationship because South Korea has been a target of cyber attacks from North Korea for such a long time, has a depth of experience, has a lot of experience to share. And not just with the United States, but other partners in the world. And, I think that when we look at crypto theft, the theft of cryptocurrency, one of the things that the North Koreans and it's not just the North Koreans, but hackers are taking advantage of is this vulnerability because there's such a lack of regulation, both on the national level and internationally. There's no regulation whatsoever. So they are going from country to country, taking advantage of this vulnerability in specific countries. And so it means that countries need to speak to one another and they need to share that information and come up with some sort of regulatory agreement so that if we're going to be using digital currency going forward, which is something that President Yoon says that he wants to embrace, that there's some protection and that there's some sharing information so that ordinary people are not vulnerable. We had the case in South Korea, right, with the plunging of the Terraform cryptocurrency. And so we can see firsthand in South Korea how vulnerable cryptocurrencies are and the need for regulation if we're starting to use them as a regular currency or as a currency in more mainstream use. But it will need to come with regulation. And that goes hand in hand, I think, with trying to understand and stop hackers as well from taking advantage of these vulnerabilities. And so I think that that's an area where I do see South Korea as being on the forefront in terms of embracing cryptocurrency. And likewise, they'll need to be on the forefront in enforcement and regulation. So that's an area where the South Koreans can really step forward and take charge and play a leadership role. But overall, I would say that one of the weaknesses I'm seeing with cyber strategies and it's not just in South Korea, it's in every country, is that people tend to have cyber experts who are looking at it from a technological point of view. But really, you need to do what we're doing, which is marry that understanding of the technology with an understanding of the psychology, the policy. And so you need to marry policy and technology. So it's not just about cyber, but it's also about the motivation that we understand how they're carrying out these attacks, not just from a technical point of view, but from a political point of view, from a day-to-day point of view, because it's not just a technical issue. It's far more than that. And so we need to start seeing our governments treat it like a policy issue rather than just a tech issue. And I would say that there's another challenge, which is that when it comes down to it, we can't compete with the motivation that Kim Jong-un has in training cyber warriors. He has staked his entire strategy on the nuclear program. And so he has also invested in these cyber warriors. They have more motivation and more pressure than any of our cybersecurity experts could ever have. And so there's a built-in asymmetry, and that's to our disadvantage. So governments, including the South Korean government, need to invest in their cyber experts, in their cybersecurity experts, and treat them like cyber warriors as well. And until that happens, we just won't be able to stop these very aggressive and very motivated North Korean hackers. And they are working for their leader, they're working for their state.